Hello, you are listening to Secret Art of Space-Time, a podcast about ideas, culture, and politics from an esoteric lens. My name is Andy, and I'll be your host. To support the show and receive bonus content and early episodes, as well as access to my full blog archive, click the link in the show notes to subscribe. You can also support the show by leaving a 5-star review, by subscribing in your favorite podcast feed and on Substack, and by sharing the show with others who may enjoy it. Enjoy the episode. Hello! So this is the third episode in a series that I've been calling Science and the Erotic Order. And today I want to discuss the book, The Master and His Emissary by the psychiatrist Iain McGilchrist. And we'll be working this book and his argument into this story that I am developing over the course of several episodes. But it is a big, hefty book, so I want to take the time to do my best to unpack it and try to summarize some of the main points here before I get back to working it into this story that I'm unfolding. So this book was first published in 2009. I think it's really important. I feel like this is a very important book. I do have a couple critiques, and those critiques will be our way back into this argument that I'm developing. But despite that, I still think this is an essential book in like the bigger picture of the evolution of thought in this period of time. The book is divided into two parts. In the first part, McGilchrist goes through neuroscience, cognitive science, psychiatry research on hemispheric difference, the difference between brain hemispheres. In the second part of the book, he weaves in a great deal of Western philosophy, all the way from the pre-Socratics to our period, as well as poetry, art, and other aspects of culture. And while he's using neuroscience and cognitive science, his argument is not reductive. He's trying to make the argument that this area of research contributes to a long line of thought, which I suppose you could summarize as arguing against a reductive, overly abstracted worldview. So to try to summarize, he argues that the two hemispheres of the brain approach the world in fundamentally different ways, but ways in which are both necessary and contribute to one another. However, certain periods in Western history, he suggests, have been sort of overcome by one of these approaches, namely the overly reductive, analytical, theoretical approach, to the detriment of the more holistic, connecting, empathetic, creative, intuitive approach. So let's first dive into the first part of the book where he explores hemispheric difference. So he definitely is careful to avoid or argue against the simplistic popular conception of the difference between the right hemisphere and left hemisphere, and painstakingly goes through enormous amounts of research to detail the different roles these hemispheres play. And he makes the point that the hemispheres differ not in what they do, but in how they do it. So both hemispheres are involved in most things, most acts, most behaviors, most cognitive processes, but they play different roles, each of which are necessary. So he begins by exploring attention. And there are many different kinds of attention that are studied in psychology and cognitive science. So there's focused attention, where we're really narrowly focused on the details. There's vigilance, there's sustained attention, there's alertness, there's divided attention. And it seems that the right hemisphere is responsible for every kind of attention except for focused attention. So the left hemisphere specializes on focusing in, on narrowing, on the details. The right hemisphere, in contrast, has a very broad attention. Its field is open. It is attuned to context and a holistic sense of what's happening, to the big picture, to the forest, compared to the left hemisphere's focus on the trees. So the right hemisphere approaches things as a whole. It's attuned to the interconnections between things, to relationship, to the in-betweenness, McGilchrist says. The right hemisphere is more pragmatic, more practical, more, you could say, grounded. The left hemisphere is concerned with abstractions and theory, with categories and systems of thought. So the left hemisphere abstracts from what the right hemisphere gives us. So the right hemisphere presents us the world in its complexity and infinitude, you could say. These are my words, not McGilchrist's. And from that, the left hemisphere abstracts, categorizes, theorizes. It follows rules. It creates systems. It, as McGilchrist says, wrests things from their context. Now, in the brain, the left hemisphere has more neuronal connections within itself. And in studies, it does appear to be more self-referential. The left hemisphere creates this world, creates this symbolic world of language and categories. And he says the left hemisphere deals with the world that it already knows, the world it has made for itself. So it extracts, in a way, from the world presented by the right hemisphere and creates a system, and then it can almost operate on its own, almost in isolation at times from the world of the right hemisphere, to elaborate its systems, its ideas, its world that it has made for itself. Now, one of the sort of popular mythologies of hemispheric difference is that the right hemisphere is responsible for creativity. But McGilchrist notes that actually both these functions are necessary in creativity. And this is confirmed by the fact that when the corpus callosum is severed, so that's the bundle of fibers that connects the two hemispheres, when it's severed, creativity is impaired. So creativity relies on both hemispheres operating together. Now, this relates to what we were discussing in the last episode around the world that is presented to us and representation. So McGilchrist suggests that the right hemisphere is responsible for what is presented, the world that is given. the world of our senses and immediate experience. On the other hand, the left hemisphere represents. It abstracts, it creates concepts and categories to represent what is presented by the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere categorizes, it generalizes. It's interested in non-specifics, whereas the right hemisphere is attuned to the individual, the specific, the particular, you could say. To connect this again to what we were speaking about last time, McGilchrist suggests the left hemisphere's perspective is like the God's eye perspective. He says an invariant view of objects, whereas the right hemisphere uses a real-world view. And this all goes very smoothly if the two hemispheres are collaborating, but at times the left hemisphere seems to take over and kind of runs away with this process of abstraction and working sort of internally with this world it's created. So McGilchrist quotes Henry Maudsley, who says, "A sufficiently strong propensity not only to make divisions in knowledge where there are none in nature, and then to impose the divisions on nature, making the reality thus conformable to the idea, but to go further and to convert the generalizations made from observation into positive entities, permitting for the future these artificial creations to tyrannize over the understanding." So in this way, the right hemisphere tends to be more personal, more concerned with living things. Although, interestingly, also musical instruments and food appear to be preferentially processed or focused on by the right hemisphere, whereas the left hemisphere is more tuned into non-living things, to tools, to inanimate objects, to machines, and the mechanical in general. So, for example, people with left hemisphere damage might be incapable of using a hammer or a padlock, whereas those with right hemisphere damage may have difficulty with practical processes such as making a cup of coffee. The left hemisphere's principal concern appears to be with utility, with what is useful. In contrast, the right hemisphere has a much broader set of values, well beyond simple utility, including a moral sensibility, empathy, connectivity, beauty, and meaning. On page 64, he writes, "Despite the right hemisphere's overwhelmingly important role in emotion, the popular stereotype that the left hemisphere has a monopoly on reason, like the view that it has a monopoly on language, is mistaken. As always, it is a question not of what, but of in what way. In fact, reasoning is of different kinds, and though linear sequential argument is clearly better executed by the left hemisphere, some types of reasoning, including deduction and some types of mathematical reasoning, are mainly dependent on the right hemisphere. More explicit reasoning is underwritten by the left hemisphere. Less explicit reasoning, such as is often involved in problem solving, including scientific and mathematical problem solving, by the right hemisphere. There is a relation between the pleasurable aha phenomenon of insight and the right amygdala, which mediates interactions between emotions and higher frontal cognitive functions. In fact, an extensive body of research now indicates that insight, whether mathematical or verbal, the sort of problem solving that happens when we are precisely not concentrating on it, is associated with activation in the right hemisphere. So while the left hemisphere is at home in language, the right hemisphere is still involved, particularly when it comes to meaning and context. So he writes, "In conditions of right hemisphere damage, where the left hemisphere is no longer under constraint from the right, a meaningless hypertrophy of language may result. So there is language, but it lacks meaning. It's through the right hemisphere that we understand the moral of a story or the point of a joke. In cases of right hemisphere damage, when the left hemisphere is operating on its own, people appear to be overly literal, have a difficult time with metaphor, with humor, with irony. The right hemisphere is also importantly involved in nonverbal communication, in gesture and tone of voice and facial expression. The right hemisphere is importantly involved in our moral sense. I'd prefer to use the word ethical here, but that's maybe besides the point. And our sense of justice, which McGilchrist notes can't be arrived at through an analytical process. He suggests that our sense of morality is holistic and rooted in empathy. It's not something we can analyze our way into, which is perhaps why these scientific theories of trying to make sense of altruism kind of miss the mark, right? It's like they're beginning from the wrong place. We begin with a sense of ethics. We don't arrive there through a logical sequential process. Our sense of self is also importantly mediated by the right hemisphere. Our understanding of who we are and our personal story. Although interestingly, the left hemisphere is more involved in self-consciousness, right? That feeling of being overly fixated on oneself and having a difficult time acting in the world. McGilchrist summarizes this chapter of the book, chapter 2, What Do the Two Hemispheres Do? He says, quote, ultimately, if the left hemisphere is the hemisphere of what, the right hemisphere, with its preoccupation with context, the relational aspects of experience, emotion, and the nuances of expression, could be said to be the hemisphere of how. This perhaps explains why conventional neuroscience, being itself largely a manifestation of left hemisphere activity, has focused so much on what the brain is doing in which hemisphere, not in what way it does it in each hemisphere. Thus, in my view, missing the significance of what it is trying to understand. Before embarking on this chapter, I suggested that there were two ways of being in the world, both of which were essential. One was to allow things to be present to us in all their embodied particularity, with all their changeability and impermanence, and their interconnectedness as part of a whole which is forever in flux. In this world, we too feel connected to what we experience, part of that whole, not confined in subjective isolation from a world that is viewed as objective. The other was to step outside the flow of experience and experience our experience in a special way, to represent the world in a form that is less truthful, but apparently clearer, and therefore cast in a form which is more useful for manipulation of the world and one another. This world is explicit, abstracted, compartmentalized, fragmented, static, though its bits can be reset in motion like a machine, essentially lifeless. From this world we feel detached, but in relation to it we are powerful. I believe the essential difference between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere is that the right hemisphere pays attention to the other, whatever it is that exists apart from ourselves, with which it sees itself in profound relation. It is deeply attracted to and given life by the relationship, the betweenness that exists with this other. By contrast, the left hemisphere pays attention to the virtual world that it has created, which is self-consistent but self-contained, ultimately disconnected from the other, making it powerful but ultimately only able to operate on and to know itself. However, I also emphasized at the outset, both hemispheres take part in virtually all functions to some extent, and in reality, both are always engaged. McGilchrist notes that in a great deal of the scientific literature, the right hemisphere has been demonized. It has been talked about in a very pejorative way, despite how clearly significant it is in brain function and in our lives. He calls this left hemisphere chauvinism. So he says, quote, "One sees it even in the language used by the most objective writers to describe the hemisphere differences. For example, the smart left hemisphere's need for precision leads to fine processing." He also notes that the left hemisphere is often described as dominant and the right hemisphere as minor or silent. And he quotes an example of this in a paper by Salomon Henschen, an important figure in neuropathology, in an article from 1926. So in this article, Henschen says, "In every case, the right hemisphere shows a manifest inferiority when compared with the left and plays an automatic role only. This fact shows the inferiority of the right hemisphere, especially of the right temporal lobe. A person who is not able to understand words after destruction of the left temporal lobe sinks to the level of primitive man. The right temporal lobe is, of course, sufficient for the more primitive psychical life. Only by using the left temporal lobe can man reach a higher level of psychical development. It is evident that the right hemisphere does not reach the same high level of psychical development as the left. The question, therefore, arises if the right hemisphere is a regressing organ. It is possible that the right hemisphere is a reserve organ." And McGilchrist continues, "Michael Gazzaniga, one of the most distinguished living neuroscientists and hemisphere researchers, carries on the tradition, and his language is in the tradition of Henschen. There are, quote, shocking differences between the two hemispheres. The left hemisphere has many more mental capacities than the right one. The right hemisphere is a distant second with problem-solving skills. It knows precious little about a lot of things," unquote. And there's more examples of this language from Gazzaniga. He also notes that the situation is somewhat reversed in popular discourse, where the left hemisphere tends to be demonized. And again, emphasizes that both are necessary. And both are necessary in a sort of circular, reciprocal way. So how we attend to the world impacts what we see, and what we see impacts how we attend. So there's no objective world out there without our engagement with it, which is not to say that anything goes. He notes that attention is a moral act, for how we attend to something determines what we see and how we engage with it. He uses the example of a beautiful place that to some people may be special because of its beauty and peace, and to others, for that very reason, may be a place to extract resources from. So how we attend to something, how we see it, determines how we engage with it. This isn't to say that the world is inherently subjective or that we make it all up, but that there is a necessary uncertainty. We can never get to some final analysis where we have the whole picture in some objective system. It's not that the right hemisphere is subjective and the left hemisphere is objective. In fact, the distinction between subjective and objective is a creation of the left hemisphere. So many of the binaries that we might be inclined to apply to the hemispheres are actually creations of left hemispheric thinking. The right hemisphere is not so concerned to decide once and for all whether something is fully objective, fully subjective, etc. The right hemisphere isn't concerned with either or thinking. It's concerned with interconnections, with the in-betweenness of things. The right hemisphere can handle the paradox of this sort of circular, reciprocal nature of reality, that we have some influence in the world, that it's not finally objective or subjective. Both solipsistic subjectivity and alienated objectivity are symptoms of left hemispheric dominance and show up in certain pathologies where the right hemisphere is less active. He compares this to the philosophy of pragmatism, and, for example, quotes Dewey, who deplored the spectator theory of knowledge. Quote, "The traditional conception according to which the thing to be known is something which exists prior to and wholly apart from the act of knowing." There's a lot here that I'm skipping, obviously, right? This book's more than 400 pages. We're not even in the second half of the book, which is more philosophical. But I'm trying to do my best to summarize, which is sort of an impossible task. So he uses Scheller's hierarchy of values as a sort of schema for making sense of the way the right and the left hemisphere differently place value on things. And I find this pretty helpful. So there's this pyramid of values, according to Scheller, with at the bottom of the pyramid, values of use and pleasure. And then above that, values of vitality. Above that, values of the intellect. And at the top, the holy, the sacred. And McGilchrist suggests that the right hemisphere considers the lower values as in service of the higher. So the only reason to consider, what's useful or what's pleasurable is if it serves the sacred, if it serves the intellect. And, we could extend this too. Like, I would think the right hemisphere would be concerned with, as McGilchrist has earlier mentioned, ethics and other people, right? The left hemisphere, in contrast, considers the higher values to be in service of the lower. Or, we might even consider the left hemisphere often dismisses or doesn't see the higher values, valuing mostly what is of use and what is pleasurable. And I just keep thinking of scientists trying to desperately understand how it is that humans could have evolved empathy. Why would humans ever behave in a way that is unselfish? This perspective is helpful for making sense of why intuitively that strikes one as, sort of a wrong approach to ethics, right? It's a very left hemispheric approach of altruism, empathy, care can only be understood in the context of selfishness, of use, right? But if we have a more holistic approach, an approach which is relying on the collaboration and contribution of both the hemispheres and both these ways of understanding the world, then it won't be such a conundrum why people ever behave unselfishly, because it's understood that not everything in the world is simply about utility, and that when it comes to ethics and morality, you can't derive that from the bottom, from utility. In fact, the correct orientation is the other way around. Ethics are given. They're intuitive. They come from the whole, not from the parts. McGilchrist summarizes this section on page 174. If one had to encapsulate the principal differences in the experience mediated by the two hemispheres, their two modes of being, one could put it like this. The world of the left hemisphere, dependent on denotative language and abstraction, yields clarity and power to manipulate things that are known, fixed, static, isolated, decontextualized, explicit, disembodied, general in nature, but ultimately lifeless. The right hemisphere, by contrast, yields a world of individual, changing, evolving, interconnected, implicit, incarnate living beings within the context of the lived world, but in the nature of things never fully graspable, always imperfectly known. And to this world it exists in a relationship of care. Now, in the next chapter, so we're already on chapter 5. I'm just breezing through this here, but, we don't have 25 hours. So in chapter 5, McGilchrist argues that the right hemisphere is primary. He suggests that the hemispheres are not equal and that the right hemisphere has precedence. It, he says, underwrites the knowledge that the left comes to have. Now, okay, McGilchrist's the expert here, but this strikes me as intuitively wrong. Isn't this a very left hemispheric approach to posit that one must be dominant or more important or primary? He says, how to break out of the hermeneutic circle. And I would say, why do we need to break out of the circle at all? Isn't that the point, that there is something inherently circular or maybe spiral-like about this process? And he even says, quote, reality has a roundedness rather than rectilinearity. So why object to the circular hermeneutic process? Why insist that one must come before the other? Why insist on placing the hemispheres in a linear hierarchy? This strikes me as very left hemispheric. Perhaps McGilchrist is wanting to swing the pendulum in the other direction, so to speak, because clearly our culture has become very left hemisphere dominant, right? And there's a need to value what the right hemisphere has to offer and the perspective that it gives. But just intuitively, so I recognize this is not based on evidence, but intuitively, I don't really get this claim of McGilchrist's, this ordering of the hemispheres. And indeed, there seems to be an internal contradiction because he wants to place the right hemisphere as higher, and yet the right hemisphere tends to take a collaborative perspective. It tends to take a circular perspective. So if we really want to value the right hemisphere, then we're not doing that by placing it above the left. You see what I mean? The right hemisphere's approach is togetherness and collaboration and cooperation, suggesting that both hemispheres are equally important. He suggests that the way attention operates is evidence for the primary role of the right hemisphere. So he says, quote, there is the primacy of broad, vigilant attention. Though focused attention may appear to its owner to be under conscious control, in reality it is already spoken for. We direct attention according to what we are aware of, and for that we need broad right hemisphere attention. Then there is the primacy of wholeness. The right hemisphere deals with the world before separation, division, analysis has transformed it into something else, before the left hemisphere has represented it. And finally, further evidence for the right hemisphere as primary, he says, is the primacy of experience. What we know had to come into being first for the right hemisphere. since by definition, at first, it is new, and the right hemisphere delivers what is new as it presences before the left hemisphere gets to represent it. And then he goes on to look at further evidence for this claim, including what he calls the primacy of the implicit. So, for example, metaphorical thought, grounding analytical thought, which there is lots of evidence for. And then the primacy of affect, that feeling comes first and then cognition. The primacy of the unconscious will. So the idea that our will is not always conscious to us. We do will things, we make decisions, but sometimes that's an unconscious process. And then that both thought and its expression originate in the right hemisphere. And then representation waits on presentation. He invokes Hegel in saying that both union and division themselves must be unified, which McGilchrist takes as suggesting again the priority of union over division. But again, isn't it more of a circular process? Like even in Hegel's system, as far as I understand it, the process continues. So there's union, there's division, there's union, and then there's division again. And it goes on and on and on. We might also say that the very concept of union requires the concept of division. To distinguish between union and division is a form of division. So I'm not convinced that union or that the right hemisphere is primary, but I'm going to try to set that aside for now and make my case for it in another episode. He does too point to Gödel, the logician, I think. Was he a logician or a mathematician? But at any rate, who created the incompleteness theorem, right? The idea that every system contains true but unprovable statements. McGilchrist elaborates, suggesting that he says there are always elements that arise from within the system that cannot be achieved by the system, and that indeed draw our attention to the limits of the system and point us beyond. He says, rationalistic systems contain the seeds of their own destruction. And this point I love. To me, this is one of the key takeaways of this whole book, that this line of research, hemispheric difference, is one among many lines of thinking that reveal the limits of an overly rationalistic, reductive, materialist way of thinking. That from this line of thought itself, right, from a rationalistic way of thinking, if we keep following it far enough, it will reveal its own limits. It will begin to perhaps even deconstruct itself. And I think this is beautiful, and one of the reasons I love this book so much, because I agree with McGilchrist that we could see many of the problems of the West as an over-reliance on this one particular way of thinking to the detriment of the other. So an overuse of the separating, distinguishing, linear, analytical, reductive, materialist, utility-focused worldview at the cost of the holistic, connecting, empathic, bringing together, moral or ethical and relational worldview of the right hemisphere. And this kind of gives me hope, because it's very hard to reason with this left hemisphere way of thinking from the perspective of the right hemisphere. I mean, I love these stories of Wittgenstein showing up at the meetings of the Vienna Circle and reading poetry, while people are trying to discuss logic, because I think that's an example of, it's like, what can the right hemisphere say to the left hemisphere when it's sort of becoming excessive or forgetting its connection with the right, with the world as it's presented, with the holistic sense of becoming. And yet that's not necessarily very effective. Like, while I completely understand that desire to sometimes just break in with poetry, to ways of thinking or people that are left hemisphere dominant, it may not be very convincing. So I think that sometimes something is needed from the inside out, from the left hemisphere, to show its own limits. Just like the incompleteness theorem. Just like so many examples from philosophy. And now here's an example from brain science. So the title of the work, The Master and His Emissary, emphasizes what McGilchrist sees as the unequal relationship between the two hemispheres and between these two ways of thinking. So he says, quote, "Right at the heart of the relationship between the hemispheres, I see a power struggle between two unequal entities, and moreover, one in which the inferior dependent party, the left hemisphere, starts to see itself as of primary importance." So he refers to the right hemisphere as the master and the left hemisphere as its emissary, which has gone off and started to see itself as very important and as no longer serving its master and as losing its way because of that. McGilchrist wants to sort of reinstate the rightful master as the master. So the right hemisphere as more important, as primary, as dominant. So later, McGilchrist says, "The value of the left hemisphere is precisely in making explicit, but this is a staging post, an intermediate level of the processing of experience, never the starting point or end point, never the deepest or the final level. The relationship between the hemispheres is therefore highly significant for the type of world we find ourselves living in. The left hemisphere is competitive, and its concern, its prime motivation, is power. If the working relationship were to become disturbed so that the left hemisphere appeared to have primacy or became the end point or final staging post on the processing of experience, the world would change into something quite different, and we can say fairly clearly what that would be like. It would be relatively mechanical, an assemblage of more or less disconnected parts. It would be relatively abstract and disembodied, relatively distanced from fellow feeling, given to explicitness, utilitarian in ethic, overconfident of its own take on reality, and lacking insight into its problems. The neuropsychological evidence is that these are all aspects of the left hemisphere world as compared with the right." So part one of the book is meant to describe the difference in the worlds created by the left and right hemisphere. In the second part of the book, McGilchrist argues that the West can be characterized by largely the dominance of the left hemisphere, but also the interplay of the two and shifts in power and shifts in the relationship between the two over the last 2,000 years. So Nietzsche famously thought that later Greek culture, epitomized by Socrates and Plato, was in decline, was decadent, was lacking in the vitality and vibrancy of earlier Greek culture, better characterized by the tragedy, by drama, by art, by poetry, rather than this, very explicit logical linear analysis of philosophy, or at least that period of philosophy. And McGilchrist suggests that this shift in culture also represents a shift in the balance of power, you could say, between the hemispheres. So earlier Greek culture being an example of a collaboration between the hemispheres, and later Greek culture being characterized as more left hemispheric. The pre-Socratic philosophers had much more patience for paradox and complexity. McGilchrist says, the most familiar point of commonality in pre-Socratic philosophy is an attempt to reconcile a sense of the apparent unity phenomenal world with its obvious diversity. This suggested that there should be some common originary principle, or arche, from which all things came, the multiplicity of appearances, phenomena, being a reflection of the mutability of the primary substance which underlies everything and could metamorphose between different states. And then later, if we are enabled to attend to experience rather than to our preconceived ideas about experience, we encounter, according to Heraclitus, the reality of the union of opposites. Appreciating this coming together wherein all opposing principles are reconciled was the essence of Sophia, wisdom, the root of philosophy, for Heraclitus. Opposites define one another and bring one another into existence. By the time of Plato, though, there's a distaste for paradox and a disrespect for the world of our senses, depicted most clearly in Plato's parable of the cave, where the world of our senses is seen to be completely illusory. The ideal world of form, mathematics, logic, is the world of truth compared to the deceptive world, the presented world that is given to our senses. This long transition from a world where there seems to be more of a balance and collaboration between the hemispheres, the pre-Socratic world, towards the time of Plato, can be seen from a broader perspective also to map onto the transition of writing from oral cultures towards pictograms to phonograms to the phonetic alphabet to the inclusion of vowels. So there's this transition into a more abstracted, more linear form of writing. And writing itself is more left hemispheric, whereas oral cultures with, more of an emphasis on the sound, the tone of voice, and perhaps even the context in which a story was being told, who was telling it, the local variations in story, all seem more right hemispheric. So this is a long, slow transition. And then beyond the time of Plato, as Rome progresses and becomes more militaristic, more colonizing, more dominant, there's also a shift in architecture that becomes less organic, more standardized. There's also a shift in Christianity towards being more rigid and dogmatic. McGilchrist suggests that the next period in the West, where we see a flourishing of the right hemisphere attitude and approach to the world, is the Renaissance. So apparently depth perception and an appreciation for depth in space as well as time, so also like longer sense of time scales, are both features of the right hemisphere. And we see both of those in the Renaissance in, for example, the deep interest in ancient history, as well as in art, a rediscovering now of perspective. Also, interestingly, apparently there's a shift in how each side of the body was understood in this period, where in the so-called Dark Ages, the left side of the body was seen as sinister, whereas in the tradition of courtly love in the early Renaissance period, apparently the left side of the body was considered more beautiful and superior. And of course, the left side of the body is associated with the right hemisphere. The Reformation, in which there's an insistence on literal interpretation of the Bible, an intolerance for metaphor, rigidity in thought, is, McGilchrist suggests, another instance of the left hemisphere coming into greater dominance. And obviously, we're just breezing through history here, but after the Reformation comes what could be called the Enlightenment. And of course, these are all very abstract and overly simplistic terms, right? But the point here is that we could understand our own history, or Western history, in the context of a series of shifts in which mode of seeing the world is more dominant. And so in terms of the Enlightenment, McGilchrist says, in his classic analysis of modernity, Cosmopolis, the philosopher Stephen Twillman saw two distinct phases to the origins of modernity. One was that of Erasmus, Rabelais, Shakespeare, and Montaigne, a tolerant literary and humanistic phase in which horizons expanded. The second, a scientific and philosophical phase, he believes, turned its back on the earlier phase in terms more rigid and dogmatic. Quote, there are good precedents for the suggestion that the 17th century saw a reversal of Renaissance values. There was, according to Twillman, a narrowing, not an expansion, of concern as one moves from the 16th century to the 17th, from Shakespeare to Racine, from Montaigne to Descartes, a, quote, narrowing in the focus of preoccupations and a closing in of intellectual horizons. And then we have the beginnings of science with Francis Bacon, who begins to develop the scientific method, which perhaps began in a more right hemispheric mode as an openness to the world, as a true empiricism with a sense of wonder and appreciation for what is and the desire to understand it better, but became over time more rigid and dogmatic and closed, leading to Descartes saying that science will make us, quote, the lords and masters of nature. The next movement, which can be described as a flourishing of the right hemispheric way of seeing the world, is perhaps Romanticism, with its interest in perception, appearance, incompleteness, even vagueness, on emotion, and even on the relationship between theory and life, between the universal and the particular. So, for example, in speaking about theory and experience, Goethe says they are not only intimately connected, but interpenetrate one another. The particular represents the universal, not as a dream and shadow, but as a momentary living manifestation of the inscrutable. This period was also characterized by an appreciation for the relationship between mind and body and between the soul and the spirit. McGilchrist quotes Wordsworth saying, I know no book or system of moral philosophy written with sufficient power to melt into our affections, to incorporate itself with the blood and vital juices of our minds. This period culminates with both the rise of scientific materialism as well as the Industrial Revolution, both of which could be understood as left hemisphere dominance. McGilchrist suggests that the Industrial Revolution could be understood as a way in which the left hemisphere takes its abstractions and externalizes them, creates them through mass-produced products, through the mechanical production of goods, creating things that are quote-unquote perfect according to the left hemisphere's concepts, right? And he suggests this occurs in parallel with almost a sort of replacement of the given world of the right hemisphere. Materialism is distinctly left hemispheric. It's a philosophy of the left hemisphere in positing that things are all that exists, right? We know that the left hemisphere is attuned to things, to objects, to utility, whereas the right hemisphere is attuned to relationship, context, betweenness, aliveness. And he suggests that materialism is a philosophy that actually undervalues matter. It's seen only according to the lowest value in Scheller's scheme of utility. Hence, our world has become not the world that is presented to us, but the world out there, a world picture in Heidegger's words. So our time can be characterized not as having a distinct picture of the world, but as a preoccupation with the world picture, with the abstraction of the world. So from Heidegger, the fact that the world becomes picture at all is what distinguishes the essence of the modern age. McGilchrist says, in his book, The Philosopher's Gaze, Modernity in the Shadows of the Enlightenment, the philosopher D.M. Levin writes that representation, the left hemisphere's role, is the characteristic state of modernity. The process of representing a thing not only distances us from it and substitutes an abstraction, a token, for the thing itself, it also objectifies and reifies it so as to bring it under control. What presence is not accepted as it presences, but, he writes, quote, subjected to a certain delay, a certain postponement, a certain deferral, so that the ego-logical subject can give what is presencing to itself, can, in other words, make itself the giver of what it receives. In this way, the subject exercises maximum epistemic control. We might say that the emblem of such an attitude, the correlate in the realm of vision, is the stare. McGilchrist goes on to mention the short story On Exactitude in Science by Borges and Casares, in which there is created a map with a 1-to-1 scale of its territory, which also draws on a Lewis Carroll story. And apparently there are some practical problems with such a map. It becomes rather cumbersome. And in the Lewis Carroll story, one of the characters says, "We now use the country itself as its own map, and I assure you it does nearly as well." McGilchrist says, the normal relationship of reality to representation has been reversed. At the beginning of this book, I summarized the left hemisphere's role as providing a map of the world. That map now threatens to replace the reality. My contention is that the modern world is the attempt by the left hemisphere to take control of everything it knows so that it is the giver to itself of what it sees. In the final chapter, McGilchrist says, quote, I have tried to convey in this book that we need metaphor or mythos in order to understand the world. Such myths or metaphors are not dispensable luxuries or optional extras, still less the means of obfuscation. They are fundamental and essential to the process. We are not given the option not to choose one. and the myth we choose is important. In the absence of anything better, we revert to the metaphor or myth of the machine. He suggests that despite the severity of our situation in which this process has kind of gone out of control, in which we've almost completely lost touch with the world of the right hemisphere, of wholeness and relationship, that sometimes the worse it gets, the better it gets. Because, quote, the obvious inauthenticity of the left hemisphere world we have come to inhabit may in itself lead us to seek to change it. Okay, so next time I want to see if we can weave this into the lines of thought that we've been exploring in the last few episodes. And perhaps, given what we've already spoken about, you might be able to anticipate some of where I want to go. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. For more information, for more content, go to Substack. The link is in the show notes. Until next time, take care.